So, welcome to everyone. It is a great pleasure to welcome you for this third public lecture of our fall series on human movement and inequalities at the NCCR on the Move. As it had been feared at the beginning of this series, we had to move entirely online. So for this lecture, and it will be probably the case also for the ones planned in December and in January. And in any case, we will keep you posted on our website. So tonight, I have the great pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Karen Phalet in the framework of these lectures. So during the first two lectures, our topic of human movement and inequalities has been tackled by the discipline of geography and afterwards of political philosophy. And tonight it will be addressed by the perspective of social psychology. And with the support of Eva Green and Judith Kende at the University of Lausanne, we have identified an outstanding candidate to meet this challenge in the person of Karen Phalet. So she is professor at the University of Leuven, and she has developed a very original line of research focused on the social and psychological dimension of migration and ethnic relations. She has written extensively on the intergroup inequalities and the kind of conflicts that emerged in the European societies who have been confronted with the challenge of accommodating immigrant minorities from increasingly diverse cultural backgrounds. And tonight she will explore the role of diversity policies and norms, attitudes in reducing, reproducing, or increasing ethnic inequalities. She will speak for about 45 minutes, and then Eva Green, who is professor at the University of Lausanne, will discuss her presentation for about 5 to 10 minutes. And afterwards, we will open the discussion to the online audience until 7:45. So, Karen, your talk is entitled Diversity, Ideologies, and Ethnic Inequalities, the Interplay of Diversity Policies, Norms, and Attitudes. And I very much look forward to listening to you. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Robin. Thanks, Eva and Judith, for inviting me. And thank you all, although I can't see you. Thank you all for joining us here tonight. I will share some ideas and studies under the title that Robin has already presented, so I can go to the next slide and present a group of people very quickly, because research is teamwork, and what I will present is the work of many researchers who have worked with me in this line of research on diversity, ideologies, and ethnic educational inequality. So I would like to start my lecture with some fast facts about school diversity in Belgium. This is the country where we are based and where we mostly do our research, although we work in comparative perspective. Our window on diversity and inequality is a big data set, which some of you may know or do know, as a matter of fact, on the children of immigrants in Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Sweden, and the UK. So in these 5 countries, we have sampled all in 550 schools. Within these secondary schools, we have sampled over 1,000 classes. It's a stratified random sample where we oversampled schools and classes with higher proportions of immigrant origin kids in them. as you can see. And in total, we have a cross-national sample of 24,000 students or youngsters of a mean age of 14, so young adolescents. Of those students, roughly 2,000 are Muslim minorities, 7,000 other minority or immigrant background students, and about 15,000 are majority non-immigrant background students. So this is our data source that we will mostly use in the rest of the presentation. When we speak about school diversity, what do we mean? Diversity does not only mean a demographic trend towards larger numbers of people with a migration background in school and in society at large, especially so in younger generations and urban areas across the countries where we do our research, but it also stands for the rapidly increasing internal diversification of migration-related diversity. So in Belgium, as in all the other participating countries, we typically have over 100 national origins in our sample, in our schools that were involved in the research. Another important fast fact is that diversity connotes multiple non-overlapping dimensions of migration-related differences, which may or may not function as markers of group difference depending on the intergroup context. So what you see here on the slide is for the Belgian sample, how many students in our sample speak a different language than the school language at home, how many children report immigrant parentage, how many children self-identify with another country, and how many children report different religious affiliation from Christian or secular. What is important is that it's not just demography. For instance, just as an example of our sample, of those who do speak other languages at home, close to 1 in 3 self-identify only as Belgian. So as psychologists, as social psychologists, this is very important information for us, how people self-identify and how they are identified or categorized by others, in particular intergroup context, using particular markers in that context. Okay. And then lastly, a very important fact about school diversity or diversity in society is that not just schools, but the schools are highly segregated. What does this mean? So what we see is that in Belgium, we have a hierarchically stratified secondary school system where students at age 11 or 12 are streamed into different tracks. And the allocation of students to tracks is unequal in line with class origins, but also ethnic origins. So what we see at the start of the secondary school career and increasingly during the secondary school career is a structural segregation, so that immigrant origin students are overrepresented in vocational tracks and underrepresented and increasingly so in academic tracks. This is not just the case in Belgium, but I think for people who know, for instance, the Austrian, German, or Dutch context, this will sound familiar. What does this segregation mean? Given the fact that there are more and more kids with immigrant background in the younger generations, this practically means in our data the near absence or absence of white non-immigrant kids in schools and classrooms that are otherwise highly diverse in terms of combining kids with different cultural and national origins. Right? So given this reality of school diversity that I've sketched, and I hope I made clear what it looks like, and otherwise you can post questions, of course, or comments. Starting from this reality of actual diversity in the schools, the segregation, the inequality, the internal diversity, as I briefly presented them here, our question is how this school diversity shapes the experiences, the everyday experiences of diversity of the kids, the youngsters who attend those schools. And what we are specifically interested in, as you can see from our title of the presentation, is the role of diversity ideologies, the interplay between the children's own diversity experiences and the diversity ideologies at the macro level of policies, at the level of norms, and at the level of individual attitudes. And we're interested how this interplay between diversity experiences in everyday interactions in schools and diversity ideologies that are communicated in schools affect ethnic educational inequalities, unequal chances in education. Okay, so this is what we will talk about for the rest of the presentation. To the next slide. So starting from the bottom up, as psychologists like to do, we like to go micro. I will start from everyday diversity experiences and how they affect the chances for inclusion and success of minority children in the schools. I have a big picture which is not very nice to look at because there's too many abstract constructs in it, but I will use it to guide you through the different levels where diversity experience and ideologies can come into play. So we start at the left, the bottom left corner with the diversity experiences of the youngsters. And under this heading of diversity experiences, we have asked about their intergroup contact experiences, so their experiences of contact with peers, but also teachers with a different cultural background. And we're interested in positive contact experiences, such as when, in the case of friendship between peers, or in the case of experiencing support from teachers, but also in less positive, ambivalent, or negative experiences, such as hostile or unequal treatment, negative stereotypes, or stigma. Sorry, I have to, yeah. So our question is, how do these experiences then affect unequal outcomes for minority kids? What is the problem? Starting again from reality, what you see here is a picture of a Belgian class in '92, and you see 5 Turkish origin boys and a Belgian teacher. Now this picture represents a then common and unfortunately still common practice of segregating immigrant origin kids in separate classes with the rationale that their language skills are insufficient to be part of the regular classes. And interestingly, these boys on the picture have all been born. They're all born in Belgium, but still they are set apart from the mainstream to learn the Dutch language. We know from research on language learning and also from social psychological research that this practice is costly because it's making primary language acquisition in first-hand contact with native speakers difficult. And it's also costly just socially because it's harder to integrate socially. And we have quite some evidence that social relationships across the groups have a positive impact, not just on well-being and social inclusion, but also on the motivation and achievement of the minority kids. I'm showing the picture because this kind of practice is being repeated in spite of all the evidence today, for instance, with refugee kids. And the only difference, I think, with this picture, this old picture, would be that there would be kids from diverse immigrant backgrounds, but the continuity is that the non-immigrant Belgian kids would be absent from this picture. What is also still there is that the teacher would be white, non-immigrant Belgian in most cases still. Yeah. As an anecdote, one of the kids on the picture is Orhan Ayda. He's a professor in educational science and a colleague of mine. So this anecdote illustrates that the diversity practices and ideologies are not just determining the future of the kids, but that there are ways to either blur the boundaries between the groups, and there are costs attached to that at the individual level, and there are also ways to challenge the boundaries or the inequalities for minorities as a group. So we will come to that in the rest of the presentation. To show this picture of segregation at the level of the daily experiences and contexts of the kids in a more scientific way, what you see here is just a descriptive plot of the social network data on the friendship networks of the kids in our research. And you can see the blue bars. Those are the friendships of minority kids befriending other minority kids to the left-hand side, or of majority kids befriending other majority kids to the right-hand side. The red bars are the intergroup friendships. So it's minority kids who nominate majority friends, or majority kids who nominate minority friends. And as you can see, there is, in a way, to say positively, there's a huge potential of unrealized intergroup friendships in this picture. Yeah. So it's not just about the structures of hierarchical tracking and inequality. It's also informal segregation at the level of classrooms and social networks and friendships, right? Now, why is this a problem, or how is this a problem? This, this unrealized potential of intergroup friendship. I'll briefly present a study where I show how this segregation, or the absence of friendships across the groups, impact unequal chances. What you see here is a study of Turkish second-generation youth in schools in the city of Antwerp. And what we asked is their retrospective school careers. So this is not the SILS data, this is retrospective data of young adults. And as you can see, so what you see, the percentages is the percentage who are in the academic track, in the general track, for the Belgian majority students, and in red for the Turkish origin students. And as you can see, over the course of the secondary school career, there's this leaking pipeline, which means that the Turkish origin kids have a disproportionate chance to not stay on in those academic tracks, and to move either to vocational tracks or to leave the school without qualifications. So this is controlled for all usual suspects, such as parental education and the school advice at the start of the secondary school. But when we add to this picture the context, so when we add positive intergroup contact, we see that we predict a reduction of the inequality. So to give an example of what this means concretely, if in the second grade you have one Belgian majority friend as a Turkish origin kid, then your chances to still be in the academic track in the third grade, and thus to access higher education, are doubled. And this is controlling for a lot of preceding variables that are usually in those types of equations, right? So intergroup contact reduces inequality. What about negative experiences? Because in reality, mixing the groups does not only mean friendship potential, it also means exposure to less positive experiences of intergroup contact, such as discrimination or unequal treatment, as a clear example of negative experiences. So what you see in the schools is that there's inequality and that it's really hard for kids to challenge the inequalities. So we see pervasive inequality in the grades, for instance, that kids receive, because the grades overlap with minority status, again, controlling for a number of other characteristics of the kids. But it's hard to challenge these grades because the dominant idea is that these grades connote deservingness and that the kids who get the lower grades are less deserving. So this is to say that the experience of inequality is not just direct discrimination, but it's really, it's ingrained in school practices where teachers allocate grades in a certain way, and where the understanding is that when you receive lower grades, that this is reflecting your lack of competence, and this is predictive of your future chances in society. So as social psychologists, we try to capture this this threat that could be experienced by minority status students in such an unequal playing field that the classroom is. And the way we try to capture this is by applying a stereotype threat paradigm, so that some of the classes and schools were assigned to a stereotype threat condition, where the students had to fill out questions about their immigrant background preceding a cognitive test, a non-verbal inductive reasoning test. And in the control condition, they answered the same questions about their ethnic or migration background after taking the test. And what we saw was, as you would expect, that when they had to answer these questions about their ethnic background, this activates related negative stereotypes about academic competence. And this translates into underperformance. So there was a significant effect, stereotype effect on their test performance. And this effect was mediated by their behavioral disengagement from the task, as we could see from post-test questions, which functioned as a mediator of the stereotype threat effects. I should add that we find similar effects of past experiences of discrimination in school, so that the kids who have experienced once or more discrimination in school would also underperform if they are in the stereotype threat condition. So we see discrimination and stereotype threat reinforcing each other, so that experiences of discrimination make you vulnerable for situational threat when your ethnicity is made salient and the associated negative expectations or stereotypes get in your way. Yeah. To add a positive finding, we also look what could moderate or reduce the effect of stereotype threats. And we saw that shared perceptions of equal treatment in school, so at the level of the classroom, when students think that teachers treat pupils equally, protect against the effect of stereotype threat. So in schools and classes where students collectively perceive equal treatment, we did not find a significant stereotype threat effect when we made the ethnicity or the migration background salient before taking the test. So this is a hopeful message, which also relates to our interest in diversity ideologies as an important factor in combination with the diversity experiences of the kids on the ground. So with this, I would like to move to the second part of my presentation, unless there are questions
Karen?
For clarification or, yeah.
Karen, I'm really sorry to interrupt you just for 1 minute. We have just a small issue with the YouTube audience. who cannot see your slides actually. And so everybody here on WebEx can see them. It's not a problem, but it's for the YouTube audience. I will just try, because it's a bit a shame if they cannot see the slides. So I will just try to, can you try just to stop the sharing and try again? We will see if it works. And otherwise I would ask the YouTube audience to move to the WebEx audience. I'm really sorry for that. I don't understand why it's the case.
Problem at all.
Just,
no.
Okay, just you can try to stop the sharing and start it again. If you can.
How do I stop it?
You go up on your screen. And it should appear the possibility to stop the sharing.
Fermer l'onglet.
Voilà. Yes.
Oui.
Exactly. Okay. Good.
So
yes.
Now I can.
And now you can try to
share.
Start again. Yeah. To
Okay. I'm going to pick
to share again. Partager.
So it's uploading now.
Yes. So
Can
yeah,
you see
we do have it on WebEx. Let me just see if we have it on YouTube also. No, we don't. We don't have it on YouTube. So yes, I'm really sorry for that, but I will ask the people on YouTube to try to move on WebEx to see your slides, because I can't make them appear. I don't know exactly what's the problem here. I'm really sorry for that, but I think that's the best way to do it. Yes, I will just invite the audience on YouTube to move on WebEx. I will share again the link and the password for all the audience. Just don't worry about the technical issues anymore. Karen, you can go on, and I'm really sorry to have interrupted you for these technical issues. I'm really sorry.
That happens. I'm sorry for the audience.
Yes, me too.
So
you can start again.
Yeah.
No, you can start again, because I don't see any other solution to solve the problem. I can't really solve the problem on YouTube. I'm really sorry for that. But you go ahead. I suggest you go ahead.
I continue.
Yes, you can continue.
Okay.
Yeah, we have tried, and I can't. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Sorry.
No problem. Yeah. So I had shown some findings linking everyday diversity experiences, positive and less positive experiences, to unequal outcomes for minority kids in schools. And I was now making the transition to the role of diversity ideologies and the interplay with these experiences. Yeah. Okay. I'm picking up my thread. Yeah. So diversity ideologies are different approaches to defining, valuing, and organizing group differences and inequalities in society. And we can study them at the institutional level of diversity policies and practices in schools. We can also study them in the middle of this flow diagram as shared norms, shared diversity norms, shared views on diversity in groups, for instance, in peer groups, and at the individual level of diversity attitudes, certain attitudes. Okay, so we now start from the top down. We will shift from the micro experiences to the more macro or institutional level of diversity policies as one angle on these ideologies. So the question here is about the interplay of both minority and majority diversity experiences with school diversity ideologies, right? This is the second part of my lecture. So what is the problem here? Schools communicate implicitly, but also explicitly and sometimes loudly about diversity. So what you see here, for instance, is a message on a school playground saying, in the interest of your child, we speak Dutch here. You too, ? So this is an injunctive norm to speak the school language, not just in the classroom, but also on the playground. And it's suggesting that parents should speak the Dutch language with their kids. This is an example of what we would call an assimilationist message about diversity. So the message here is that the immigrant kids and parents should adopt the mainstream culture, in this case, the language, the Dutch school language. It's not just about language, it's also about culture and about religion. And in these days of the year, there's again a lot of debate about Santa Claus and Black Pete. I don't know if you're familiar with this tradition in the Netherlands, Belgium, and some other countries or regions in Europe, I think. This is a very controversial tradition. It's a white saint with black helpers who bring presents to the kids. They throw the presents through the chimney. And this tradition has actually been condemned by the United Nations in 2016 because of the racially offensive characteristics of Black Pete, the helper of Santa Claus, the white saint. And there's been ever since a lot of debate about this whole tradition, with some people claiming that it's part of our culture and identity as Belgians, for instance, and other people challenging this and asking to change the tradition to make it less offensive or to include diverse kids. And what you see here is just an example in Dutch. I won't translate the whole letter, but it's a letter by a school director. And it's addressing immigrant parents, and it's asking the parents to respect our Belgian culture and traditions. And the incident that preceded the letter was that some immigrant origin kids had challenged the existence of Santa Claus and had told the Belgian kids that the saint didn't exist. And interestingly, so it's typically colorblind because it's not referring at all to any possibly offensive aspects of the tradition. And it's even paying lip service to multiculturalism because the letter says, we want you to talk to your kids that they should respect our culture like you want us to respect your Islamic religious festivals and traditions. Yeah, so this is an example to say that schools communicate about diversity in ways that are not always welcoming or valuing the different cultural backgrounds of the kids. We are applying in our research concepts to classify diversity approaches or ideologies that have mostly been used at the national or local policy level, but we are applying those to the school level when we talk about school practices, school rules, school mission statements. And we distinguish between, like following Guimont and colleagues and some other colleagues, we distinguish between three like major approaches of diversity. One we label multiculturalism, when minority cultures are valued and cultural difference is accepted. At the other side, you see assimilationism, when it's mainly or only the majority culture that is being valued and cultural difference is rejected. There's no place in school for other cultures or for cultural differences. And in the middle, you see what we call individualism. It's akin to what in the US has been called color blindness, which is a bit of a heterogeneous cluster of approaches, but what they have in common is that they emphasize, they value the individual person while ignoring or de-emphasizing group differences or cultural differences. Yeah, so this is our starting point. And what we did in this study with Laura Celeste Gülseli-Bayshu, Luz Meusen, and Judith Kende is we analyzed the school policies as a possible moderator of ethnic inequalities in the schools. So what we looked at was at the individual level, how minority status, so immigrant background of the kid or the parents, was related to inclusion as assessed by their self-reported school belonging, and how it was related to their success as assessed by their grades for math and language in school. And what we see at the individual level is, as you would expect, or as we know from other studies, that minority kids are feel significantly less belonging, and that their achievement is significantly lower than that of comparable majority students or kids. So we see a belonging gap and an achievement gap at the individual level. And the question is then if we can find what role do these diversity ideologies play to either exacerbate or mitigate these inequalities. And to operationalize the ideologies, we coded the school diversity policies, the mission statement, and the rules of the schools, the rules and the sanctions of the schools. And we used partly a top-down approach from these three major diversity ideologies in the literature, and partly an inductive bottom-up approach from the materials that we were coding to develop our coding scheme. And we conducted a cluster analysis on the codes where we could identify three major clusters that corresponded to the major approaches that have been distinguished in the literature. So one factor is the multiculturalism factor, or cluster, sorry. And a quote is, given the multicultural character of our school, students and educators are committed to learn, understand, and value cultural diversity. Another cluster. Right. Another cluster is individualism. So an example is, we strive for a school where everyone is recognized and respected as a unique person. Or another example, we focus on students with different talents without distinction of background or origin. Then a third major approach is assimilationism, where the majority culture is valued and minority cultures are excluded. For instance, when your child hears, speaks, reads Dutch only during school hours, it's an impossible task for the school to teach an adequate knowledge of Dutch. So this is the language issue, which in the Belgian context is very sensitive and politicized. And the other very sensitive issue is, of course, religion, not allowed headscarf. So specifically Islamic religious expression is banned in this statement. Importantly, school policies are not orthodox in a way, in the sense that they do shift, or they do combine vocabularies from different approaches. So what we can see, for instance, is that the same school can give a multiculturalist language, or at least pay lip service to multiculturalism, like saying that they attach the greatest importance to mutual respect for everyone's religious beliefs and cultural identity, while at the same time then, especially in the rules of the school, sanctioning certain cultural expressions, such as other languages or other religions. Yeah. Okay. So when we give each school in the data, we have about 70 schools, a score for multiculturalism, assimilationism, and individualism in their diversity policies at the school level in a multi-level analysis. We find that these approaches or ideologies do matter in a sense that they do not just directly impact on the outcomes, but they also moderate, change the association between minority status and less favorable outcomes, less inclusion, less success. So how does it look? We see that assimilation over the course of 1 year widens the belonging gap between minority and majority students. So more assimilationist schools are more unequal in terms of the belonging gap. And the mirror image is true for schools. The more multiculturalist they are, the more the gap is narrowing, the gap in belonging. And interestingly, individualism, which in itself is not rejecting difference or not negative, it's just ignoring or seeing differences as irrelevant. So individualism is also associated with a widening of the gap. And here you see the achievement gap for, I think it's for mathematics grades, math grades. And interestingly, we find that the achievement gap in more, so the effect of color blindness on the achievement gap is mediated through less belonging. So minority kids experience less belonging in more colorblind schools, and this in turn affects their grades 1 year later. Okay. So this, when this research was published, we got quite some media attention, and this is an example of a media message. We were also on television news and on the children's television news with these findings. Okay. And having seen that really existing policies do make a difference in outcomes and inequality, we were of course interested to see if we could actively create policies that include kids. And this is just a glimpse of a pilot study by Laura Celeste in a London school with an almost all minority school where almost all the kids had some immigrant backgrounds, but the Caribbean kids were the most disadvantaged in terms of their educational outcomes. And it was an intervention study, a field intervention, where the school communicated at the beginning of the year a policy that was either multicultural or assimilationist or individualist. So I'm showing here the message for the multiculturalism policies. And what we find is that, yeah, it's called integrationism here in the picture. Sorry, it's the same as multiculturalism. So what we find is that only for the Caribbean kids in the condition where the teachers communicate the multicultural policy, we see that they're less, that their underperformance is reduced, and that this is mediated by lower levels of identity threat after the communication as compared to their baseline levels of identity threat in the pre-measure. Interestingly, for the Asian origin kids, the individualist approach, where their individual person was valued, not the minority culture, was more effective in reducing threat. But importantly, it's the Caribbean, the Black kids who were underperforming. So what the multiculturalism intervention did was reducing the inequality. It didn't make it better for the Asian kids. To the contrary, slightly worse, but it did reduce the gap between the Black kids and the Asian kids in the school. So this is very briefly an example of the next stage in our line of inquiry, where we are trying to intervene and implement more inclusive practices and policies in schools, and to assess how these affect the inclusion and success of the kids and the inequalities between minority and majority kids. Okay. Then in a very last part of my lecture, I would like to briefly present or discuss yet another angle on diversity ideologies at the meso level of shared norms about diversity. And we're interested here in peer group norms in the diverse schools and classrooms. And we've data on perceived norms, but also on the actual norms, which we operationalize as the average attitudes of peers. So the average diversity attitudes of your peers would be the descriptive norm in your peer group or in your classroom. Okay, I will show what this could look like if I have time to illustrate this. So this is a study by Laura Celeste, where she had her dependent measure was a measure of exclusion, and it was a sociometric measure, so an external objective measure of intergroup victimization. So she was interested in assessing the risk of becoming the target of interethnic victimization in your class using our class network data. So this is how this was calculated. And then the hypothesis was that if you're in a classroom where your peers endorse diversity norms that are less inclusive of your minority culture, or that are stressing the majority culture, so that are more assimilationist, that this could increase the risk of becoming a target of interethnic victimization for the minority kids in class. What you see, the different lines, are the minority kids' own diversity attitudes. So the big picture is that, okay, these diversity attitudes of the minority kids, they do matter for the risk to be victimized. But across individual diversity attitudes, you see that in classrooms where peers stress the adoption of the majority culture, so where there is an assimilationist peer norm, the minority kids are more at risk of being nominated as victim of interethnic bullying or rejection. And the opposite is true in classrooms where the maintenance of the origin culture is accepted or valued as a norm. Again, across individual diversity attitudes, you see this normative effect on the risk to be victimized. Yeah. So this is evidence of the effect of diversity ideologies at a more meso level of peer group norms. I think I can leave it at that. This is another study differentiating further between the diversity norms of your minority subgroup within the class as distinct from the diversity norms that are the mainstream norms. And what you see is that when these norms diverge, it's really hard for minority kids to navigate the norms and to avoid exclusion from the minority group if they don't maintain the minority culture, and to avoid exclusion from the larger group if they don't fit in with this mainstream culture. So this is the misfit problem of peer norms. So skip the specifics of this study because I would like to leave enough time for your questions or comments on the things that I've discussed. So maybe just in retrospect, we started from since I'm aware that not all of you could see the slides with the findings, but we started from the diversity experiences of minority kids in diverse schools. And we saw that positive experiences of intergroup contact have real effects on disparities, inequalities in outcomes for minorities, so that when you have majority friends, this tends to reduce the gap in achievement and attainment. And this is an aspect of intergroup contact, I think, that has received less attention, but that for the minority side is more important than changing attitudes, because their attitudes towards the majority are not so negative, but there are real disparities in outcomes. And intergroup contact, positive intergroup contact, is an important protective factor in that respect. We also showed one example of a study where you can see that negative intergroup experiences can harm. So we showed a stereotype threat field experiment where you saw that that negative stereotypes can hinder minority kids and can contribute to inequality. But you could also see that schools that communicate equal chances in this study effectively protect minority kids against threat. And then in the major part of the presentation, we showed some studies where we tried to assess diversity ideologies and their interplay with the diversity experiences and the outcomes of the kids. And I think that across the macro level of the policies and the meso level of the norms, you could see that more inclusive norms, more multicultural norms are supportive and reduce inequalities, whereas assimilationist norms or individualist norms that deny or reject diversity tend to reproduce or exacerbate the inequalities. And interestingly, in these last studies, I didn't really focus on the individual diversity attitudes, whereas most of the research in social psychology is actually at this individual level of the attitudes. But you see that for minorities, very often these attitudes are not the whole story or not even the main part of the story. It's very much about how others think about diversity, how the social environment deals with diversity. Right. Okay. So with this, I would like to conclude, and I hope, I'm open to any comments or questions that you might want to share. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Very fascinating talk. I will now leave Eva Green to discuss and comment your presentation, and afterwards we will open to the questions from the audience. Eva, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Robin. Well, first of all, thanks a lot, Karen, for your talk. I really liked it. I think I've heard parts of it before. And in general, I like, Karen was in Lausanne, that's why I've heard parts of it before, because she came some time ago to visit us. In general, I really like your work. And what I really like here is that it's always has applied relevance. And it really shows what are the challenges we are confronted with in these multicultural Western countries. The studies are neat. From my perspective, this is the methodological approaches I use myself, like the multi-level approach, the longitudinal approach, and experimental approach. And you bring all the studies together very nicely and very convincingly argue and show what are the factors that are shaping the achievement gap between the immigrant minority. In your case, I think they're mainly second generation, and the majority pupils or youngsters in Belgium and elsewhere in the comparative studies. So it's not very hard to see what is at stake when such a gap persists. And of course, it's worrying, as it's simply and plainly means that there's a maintenance and a reinforcement of a societal hierarchy where the national majority will remain on the top of the ladder with better jobs, with more material resources, more power. And your kind of research kind of powerfully shows and sets a kind of a call what society should be doing in the future if we want to make this gap smaller in terms of policies, multicultural policies, but I also think in terms of anti-discrimination policies, given what your research shows of the impact of discrimination experiences, and also importantly, what is the role of teachers? At least the chapter you base your talk on very much underscores the impact of how pupils experience not only peer discrimination, but teacher support and teacher discrimination. So I think that's something what obviously should be addressed beyond academic research in terms of teacher training. So I think there's clearly an applied relevance, and what I hear from your talk that you have had some your research does attract interests beyond academia, and I think rightfully so. I think the paper and in general the research you present, it makes an important contribution to acculturation research. You didn't highlight that much, but because of the audience, but that you make this link between acculturation and achievement, and that's something what has been less studied in acculturation research in general. And more importantly, what you highlighted in your talk is the role of these contextual factors, such as policies, or mainly policies, and the shared norms in shaping this process between acculturation and achievement. Of course, I'm very keen on this research in general because our NCCR IP also works on policies, and it's not a coincidence that Judith Kende, she did a PhD with Karen and is now a postdoc in our IP. We don't work on achievement, but more so majority attitudes and minority attitudes, and we've looked at the link between acculturation and naturalization intentions too. So there is some things we can draw from, even though we're not working on achievement, but more kind of attitudinal and some other behavioral factors in our research. So today, like I said, I knew this work before, but now when I went back to the paper, I thought it would be nice to make some link between the NCCR as a whole. And I think I was looking at the NCCR, I'm sorry, the migration mobility nexus, what is one of the big themes in the NCCR, and this idea that migration and mobility as analytic concepts or categories, legal political categories, is something what is not, there's not a strict definition between migration and mobility. And from my point of view, acculturation could be linked to this conceptualization. Instead of thinking of migration and mobility as political legal categories, we could also think of acculturation in these kind of this similar way as a continuum, as the migration mobility continuum, but as a subjective experience, because we are looking at how individuals relate to the receiving society in terms of integration, assimilation, or separation. So it's the same idea, or you can draw a parallel between this migration and mobility continuum, in my view. And I'm considering this as a kind of a psychological or social psychological conceptualization of this migration mobility continuum. And I also was thinking of the other aspect of the migration and mobility nexus, this enablement angle. And I think the role of policies, what Karen's talk brings in as the macro level factors shaping the link between acculturation and achievement, is one way of looking at enablement in the migration mobility nexus. So this was my kind of take, social psychological take on the migration mobility nexus, but I must admit I've sometimes had hard to kind of situate my own research in. So I was trying to go take a step further today when I was discussing Karen's work. So maybe this speaks more to the NCCR audience than to Karen, but I wanted to kind of bring this in. It's something we discuss frequently in the NCCR. So the questions I have to you, Karen, or what I would like to hear you say more about is first of all, the role of discrimination. The way I understood it when I was looking at your paper and your talk, that you discuss perceived discrimination as one concept, and I was wondering that wouldn't it make sense to distinguish experiences of structural discrimination and interpersonal discrimination? And I think you mainly group it, so I think it would be interesting to hear. Have you seen any differences? Have you disentangled these discrimination experiences? Then another thing what I would be interested in hearing about is that there's a lot of work. It's been theorized by Bourris or by Zagefka Brown, this idea of discrepancy, or mismatch between a minority and majority acculturation expectations, or minority and majority norms, as you call them. But I was wondering, have you looked at a discrepancy between the policies and the norms? Because that would be also another angle what could be interesting to look at. And then still a third aspect, still related to norms, is that you looking at injunctive norms. What about descriptive norms? And I wasn't quite sure, because I was in the understanding that what you were studying, even on the aggregate level, when you talked about shared norms, that they were injunctive norms, because there were this idea of how one ought to behave, how one ought to integrate. What about just descriptively, that how people perceive that minorities are behaving, how minorities perceive other minorities, that like taking the look not only at the ought to aspect, but also just as how people describe the context around them. So these would be my kind of questions to you, and then I think after that we can have the audience ask questions.
Thank you very much, Eva. I suggest that Karen answers directly your comments and questions. Just one small thing, Karen, if you can just stop the sharing of your slides so we can see you.
And open the mic.
and open your microphone afterwards. Yeah, also. So that would be more comfortable. And yes.
Yes, like
could you? Can you just
I'm trying
to go up on your screen, and it should propose you to stop. Yeah, exactly. Perfect. So I suggest you answer the comments and questions from Eva, and afterwards we'll open.
Okay, first of all, thank you, Eva, for bridging my talk with the NCCR initiative. It's really fascinating how you bring together very different disciplines. I'm understanding that my predecessor was a political philosopher, so I can see the kind of mental gymnastics that you're involved in. And thank you for doing the bridging, and I'm really fascinated by the whole enterprise, and I hope to learn more about it in a more interactive way in the future. I suggest that I briefly respond to your questions so that we can pass on the floor to the audience. Thank you for your questions. They're all very interesting questions. So first of all, you asked about the role of discrimination, and I indeed did not talk. I just talked about personal discrimination. But you're right that in social psychology and also in our data, we can distinguish personal or interpersonal experiences of discrimination from a more structural level of discrimination. So, for instance, people can perceive group discrimination or structural discrimination without personally necessarily experiencing discrimination. And interestingly, we also see some protective effects of perceiving discrimination at the structural or group level, because it helps minorities to define collectively the disadvantages or the inequalities that they're facing. So I know from other studies that there are some clear examples that it can, that it's not necessarily harmful, but to the contrary, it could be protective if people perceive real inequalities as structural discrimination or group discrimination. It can even protect them against the harmful effect of their personal or interpersonal experiences of discrimination. We have some findings that suggest that this could be the case, but I know there are other studies that show it much more clearly. So you're absolutely right that we should distinguish between these different meanings of discrimination. And I know there's a literature on critical awareness of inequality and discrimination, also in educational science, showing that this can be really protective and empowering for minorities as distinct from the personal experience. So the worst possible combination is to have the personal experience without a collective definition of this personal experience as a structural problem or a shared problem that is linked to your minority status. So I think there's much more to explore and to articulate, partly with our data and certainly also with other data, to find, that could be more fine-grained and that could tease apart these different levels or meanings of discrimination, how they, and the interplay between those. The asymmetries between acculturation attitudes, or I've called it now diversity attitudes, but the way we measure it is really in the tradition of acculturation research. So it's really interesting what you ask about possible discrepancies between the policies, like the formal policies that are in place on the one hand, and then those norms. We do see that for the teachers that there's a lot of leeway between the formal policies and what teachers are seen to communicate by the kids. And it would be really interesting to see how the peer norms are formed as a function of the policies of the school. And I think that Judith may have some like preliminary analysis that speaks, and it's definitely something that interests us as a next, if we can look at the interplay, especially like when can peer norms in highly diverse schools challenge assimilationist or colorblind policies from the top down. So I think this is a really fascinating line of research that is still very much, just beginning basically, and we have data that could help us to find out something about that. So thank you. And then you're right, the peer norms that we study are really injunctive, partly in terms of the question wording. It's really explicit positions about what minorities should do, like whether they should adopt or maintain. And it's also injunctive in the sense that when the minorities don't fit in with the norm, that there is a social sanction attached. That's another meaning of injunctive, and because they can be rejected or victimized if they deviate from the norm. So you're right. And I think it would be really interesting to see how we can look at those more subtle descriptive norms. I'm thinking of the research that Nadia Garay is doing, where she looks at perceptions of fit or misfit, like are minority kids with certain, so we use vignettes with certain cultural characteristics of the kids, and then we ask, are they seen as true or real Belgians or not? And then we see that the perception of fit or misfit with the Belgian identity as a function of the cultural differences predicts whether kids themselves self-identify as Belgian. So if minority kids see kids that are culturally different as misfitting with the Belgian identity, this will negatively predict their own national identification. So there's maybe a link to what you're doing on naturalization, that if you just perceive cultural differences as something that misfits with being Belgian or being a true national, that will get in the way of your being part, your inclusion in the national identity. And this is, I think, going in the direction of something that is not injunctive, but that is just something that kids pick up about how things are, like what Belgianness is. Yeah, thank you. I'll stop here. I could say much more, but
Thanks a lot,
to be
Karen.
continued later.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Yes, thank you very much for these. We have some questions in the chat bar that I see now. Imen Kitar asks about, you talked about these negative stereotypes that can contribute to school inequalities. And she asks whether some more positive stereotypes could have the same effects. I mean, for example, we know these kind of stereotypes that we can have on Asians, for example, that are supposed to be good in maths or something like that. And she asks, I'm sorry, I'm the mediator here, but she asks whether the same effects would be observed. That's a little bit how I can translate her question. And she has another question that I can see on the chat bar. I do this both because it's the same person. She asks, do you think that our learning system that is mainly based on selective learning could enhance discrimination and prejudice against immigrants? So those are the two questions asked by Imen Kitar, who I thank for these questions. Yeah.
Thank you for two very good questions. I think, there is evidence of a stereotype lift effect. If your group is positively stereotyped relative to other groups in a certain domain, then this may boost your performance and your confidence and your performance, your engagement and performance. I think from an applied perspective, it would be important that then, that it's not just turning the tables, like comparing or competing with another group that is then negatively stereotyped. And it should also probably be realistic in a sense that it should be about real achievement. You should really provide and communicate success experiences of, for instance, minority kids in school, in the academic domain. It's possibly a way to go, but then I think it's more than just an experimental manipulation. In reality, we should really provide those role models, those success experiences of kids of minority groups to destigmatize the groups, to lift the stereotypes. So that's definitely a way to go, stereotype change. That would be interesting to pursue that further. And your second question is more about the structural inequalities in these, as I understand, if I understand you correctly, it's more about these structural inequalities in certain school systems that are more hierarchically structured. They do, as I think Gülseli Bayshu and has shown this cross-nationally, that these characteristics of the school systems, they increase real inequality in outcomes in school. So they increase the unequal status and the unequal outcomes between minority and majority groups. And they also increase the association between your origins, ethnic and class origins, and your attainment, so where you end up. So in that sense, they reinforce the real disparities, these systems. And so, yes, they do also reinforce then these prejudices and negative stereotypes, because they're confirming those stereotypes. They're reproducing the disparities that confirm the stereotypes. So yes, I'm thinking if we have any research connecting the structure of the school system to attitudes like prejudice, maybe. I would expect that there would be a connection, but I can't think of any empirical study really connecting that institutional level, but they may exist, they should exist. Yeah, it's a good hypothesis and it's very plausible. That would be my answer.
Thank you very much. For the moment, I don't see any other questions here on the chat bar, but if anyone wants to add a comment or ask question, they are very welcome. We have until 7:45 at the maximum, so don't be shy, you can ask your question. But if it's not the case, I will just jump in with a small question. For you, Karen, I was very curious and quite puzzled about the results that you had about the individualist norms that are reproducing, that tend to reproduce inequalities. And I was wondering whether you can, because to me it's a bit counterintuitive, or I don't know. And I was wondering whether you have some hypotheses to explain that. How can we grasp this this kind of counterintuitive finding? Second to you,
yeah,
if you have.
Yeah, it's maybe important. Yeah, I can say many things about it. Maybe it's easier if I make it more concrete in the Belgian context. The kinds of policies that were coded as individualist often co-occur with secularist ideologies of so-called religious neutrality. And there's a socio-political context of contention where Muslim Islamic background communities, students, families are challenging this doctrine of religious neutrality. So within this socio-political context, that's I think an obvious reason why this could be negative is that just the term neutrality, the doctrine of neutrality with regard to religion, the fact that this is connected to individualism, if I look at the policies in the Belgian context, this could already explain why major minority groups with a Muslim background in our context would feel excluded. We did distinguish between assimilationist policies, if they say, for instance, headscarves are banned, and the individualist policies, they just say that they don't want any religious signs because they're only about the individual person and they don't want any. But from the perspective of the minority, I think this is a really subtle difference between the policies. So that's the grounded answer in the Belgian context. More generally, if you look at policies that are meritocratic, like individualism has many faces, let's say. It can be egalitarian in principle, or it can be more meritocratic. So it can imply that minorities are less deserving if it's very meritocratic, while ignoring inequalities in the background of the pupils. But it can in principle also be egalitarian. And there are some examples of individualism coupled with egalitarianism, like ideas of fairness or equal chances. And I know that in some contexts, like in France, but also in some Belgian contexts, there can be a positive side to individualism. So I'm not saying that individualism, I think it's not so simple. I think all these discourses are used at certain, in certain contexts. And they are used to either like reinforce power hierarchies or attenuate or challenge them. So we should look much more closely, I think, at the situated use of these discourses in the schools, because we do see in the documents of the schools, and especially in what the teachers communicate, that it's not orthodox, that they're like using vocabularies from different diversity ideologies. At a certain moment, in a certain interaction or in a certain situation. So, I think what we see is like the big picture, that this individualist policies, which stress that it's all about the individual person, and that it's not relevant where you come from or what your culture is, that in general, these policies tend to alienate minority kids and to increase the gaps in achievement on average. But then I think it becomes more interesting if we look more closely, and also more complicated. So yeah, but we can talk about that later and longer. It's a very interesting question. Yeah, these diversity ideologies are much more complex than what I've shown you. Yeah, so yeah, if you look in the data, what schools communicate, it's yeah, it becomes more real and also more complicated. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Are there any other questions here on the chat? Can't see any for the moment, so I think that's not the case.
Everybody's tired.
Maybe a little bit. Yeah, but I want to reiterate what I said before. So thank you very much for this fascinating talk and
for the invitation and for being a nice audience. And I'm sorry about the fact
I'm really sorry.
I could not share my slides.
Yeah, I'm really sorry for that.
Should have tried it out.
It's also my fault.
Too bad.
And,
no, it's nobody's fault. It's technology's fault.
Exactly. We will put that on the back of technology. But I think I learned a lot, and I thank also Eva Green for her comments, and also for bringing in the migration mobility nexus in the debate, which has been one of our big concern here at the NCCR on the Move. And yeah, I see there is one more question, maybe on YouTube. I'm sorry, I'm a bit lost here. Yes, Leah Portman has one question. She asks, she's wondering whether you have also analyzed how diversity approaches at the macro level impact how majority children perceive minority peers. Yeah, because that's, I think it's a good question also to reverse the perspective. Did you know?
There are these asymmetries between the minority and the majority position. So the same policies can be communicated, but the message is of course different depending on your group position or group status. And I should say that we're only starting to look into how these policies affect majorities, but it seems that they do affect mainly attitudes, or what you can call intercultural or global competences in majority kids. So that multicultural policy, they can benefit from multicultural policies in that respect, but there can also be a reactive edge to it. So that, you should think of those schools where majority kids have a local minority status in terms of the numerical status, that there are more immigrant origin kids than white kids in their classroom. That's often the case. So, and then when they feel that a multicultural policy is only about the other cultures and is not including them, that may be really threatening for them. And we have some indications in research on peer norms, for instance, that majority kids, as they grow older and they go through the school system, that they tend to become, they may react negatively to when they are in the numerical minority. But there's a lot to find out there. I think, again, this is a really important question. And in my next grant proposal to get more funding, we really try to shift focus to the story of majority kids and what they, how it is to be like white majority as societal status in these highly diverse schools. I think that there's a lot to find out. yeah, to be continued. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, we have one more question.
It's allowed. Yeah.
Big question.
Oh.
Can you read on the chat?
Let me see. I'm scrolling down now.
Adrian Phalet has a question about your definition of majority. I'm reading out loud. I'm sorry, Adrian. That's not good translated, but about the definition of the category of the majority population. That's a big question also in our NCCR on the move framework, and I will leave it up to you to answer this complex question.
It's, as I said it in my reply to the previous question, I think that what we call the majority kids are often, numerically speaking, a minority, since the schools are so highly diverse, and there's also segregation. So it's not just any minority kids who attend these highly diverse schools. There's a lot of inequality within kids without migration background, and there's more and more kids who have like mixed parentage, and so the boundaries are blurred, I think, from the perspective of the kids and how they experience diversity. On the other hand, there's a very strong discourse, like seen from the top down, about Belgian being either like Belgian, native Belgian, or having this an immigration background. So I think we should be careful not to reproduce this discourse by making the comparisons, but at the same time, when we do take, for instance, the education of the parents, the country where the parents were born, that is a much stronger predictor of your grades in school than if you take any cognitive test. So in that sense, these are social facts, and they are very persistent. If you're interested in educational inequalities, they are really unfortunately, very strong predictors still. In spite of, the fact that it's only, these are important markers that are very predictive, but they are just a very selective aspect of the social reality of diversity on the ground. And I think it's a big difference also how it works in the peer culture and how it works for teachers who allocate grades to students. So depending what the outcome is that you're interested in, I think if you're interested in the grades that they get in the attainment, then it's quite relevant to make these comparisons to see how ethnic inequality, class inequality is reproduced by the system. But if you're interested in inclusion in the peer group, for instance, or in peer group norms, then it's really interesting to not think only in terms of parentage, but to think, for instance, in friendships. We even saw that, for instance, kids change their ethnic self-identification over the waves, over the repeated measures, as a function of the group of friends they hang out with. So it's not your parents who give you your ethnicity, it's also your friends. So for instance, as a Turkish kid, you could become Italian. We saw in the next wave if you hang out with Italian kids. So I'm all for opening up the categories, and there's much more to be said about, especially at the level of the diversity experiences and the way kids would identify themselves and link up with friends and in the networks. That's much more fluid.
Many thanks for this answer and for your question, Adrian. I don't see now any other questions, but I say again, thank you, Karen, and thank you, Eva, for your interesting comments. I'm again sorry for the problems, for the technical problems that I had. And I look forward to hearing you during our workshop tomorrow, Karen. And thank you again for for this fascinating talk. I will now close the session.
Okay, thank you for
say bye-bye
your
and
support. And thank you,
nice
Eva.
evening.
And thank you all others whom I can't see for their comments and questions and thoughts.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a nice evening.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Bye, Eva.
Bye, Karen.